Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this debate put on by PoliticsNY, Schneps Media. And of course, we're doing a series of debates as we lead into the August 23rd primary. Yes, an August primary. Seems a little hot for one, doesn't it, Steve Witt?
Yes, it does. Good evening, Jen. Thank you.
Yeah, good evening. How are you? So I'm Jane Hanson, and Steve Witt and I are co-hosting this panel this evening. In addition to which, Steve is our official timekeeper, which means he's going to keep everybody honest on how much time they speak. So are you up to the task again tonight?
I am, and what Jane will give you the amount of time, and then when you get there, I'm going to do a little wave, and then I'll let you go on a little bit. But if I give a second wave, that means like you're pushing it, and third wave, and it's like you're done. Right?
So tonight we are focusing on Senate District 27, which includes Greenwich Village, the East Village, the Lower East Side, Chinatown, SoHo, Tribeca, the Financial District, and Battery Park City. And we are going to be introduced to our candidates in just a moment. But first, I want to set up the format. Each of them will have 2 minutes for an opening statement. Then we'll have a round of questioning by Steve and I. And if you, one of the candidates, and that would be a minute each to respond. And if any one of you want to respond to what somebody else says, just raise your hand, that little hand thing you've got there. And we'll put you back on for 30 seconds. And then we're going to have a little round where you can ask each other a question, and then a 2-minute closing statement from each one of you, providing that we haven't eaten up all of the time by then. So let's get rolling. So allow me to introduce who's with us this evening. We have the incumbent, Brian Kavanagh, who actually represented District 26, but in this whole redistricting kind of chaos, is now the incumbent in District 27. So it's part of his old district and then he's got some new people as well, because it's all of Manhattan now instead of that part of Brooklyn. His challengers are Vittoria Fariello, who is a Democratic district leader in Lower Manhattan and Lower Manhattan, and a lawyer, not a lawyer. Good evening to you, Vittoria. Nice to see you. And then also running is Danyela Souza Egorov, who is a founding board chair of Brooklyn Rise Charter School in Sunset Park and a vice president of the District 2 Community Education Council, known as the CEC. So welcome to all of you. So let's begin. Let's start with our opening statements. Vittoria, why don't you take it away? 2 minutes.
Sure, thank you. And thanks so much for hosting this tonight. So my name is Vittoria Fariello, and I'm running for state senate to give our communities a voice in what happens to us. I'm running to bring true affordable housing, healthcare for all New Yorkers, and a government that works for the people it's supposed to serve. I am a lawyer with a background in anti-corruption, and my husband and I run a public service-oriented law firm that's across the street from City Hall. I've stood up to party bosses who have cut backroom deals and tried to disenfranchise party members. When our current state senator was given a nomination in the backroom deal, I made sure we changed the rules so this couldn't happen again. I've worked with other reformers to make our own Democratic Party more democratic. And I won a lawsuit against our own party when our leadership tried to disenfranchise its own members. I've been in the streets, at meetings, and at the table, helping our neighbors stand against greedy developers and landlords. I was arrested for standing up with the Chinatown community when the city insisted on moving forward with a plan to build a mega jail. I advocate for community-led zoning and resiliency. I've been fighting to end the exploitation of workers, especially our home healthcare workers. I stand up for our communities, and I'll stand up for everyone in our district. Our voices must be heard. Too often, our leaders ignore the ideas and needs of our communities. That's not just disrespectful, it's foolish. Our communities are our greatest asset. I am deeply rooted in our Senate district. I've lived here since 1998. I saw the South Tower being hit on 9/11. We chose to stay in Lower Manhattan to raise our 4 children here and build our business here because we believe in the people of this community. I'm running so people from all across our district can have a leader they can talk to, work with, and count on. I would be honored to represent our district in the state senate.
Thank you very much. Danyela?
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Danyela Souza Egorov, and I am a mother of 2 boys who are public school students. As Jane said in the beginning, I am Vice President of the Community Education Council, and I've been working with education for over a decade because education has been my passport for a better life. I grew up in Brazil, my husband grew up in Ukraine, and we're just so grateful for all the opportunities that we have had here in New York City. We tell our boys every day, not only you're so lucky you were born in America, but you live in the greatest city in the world. And that's why I'm running for office, because I want New York to continue to be a place of opportunity. And what has happened with our city over the past few years is the opposite of that. We have seen rising crime, and we have seen our elected officials doing nothing. Even this week, Mayor Adams is asking the legislature to create a special session to address bail reform so he can actually control crime in the city, and nobody's going to be in Albany doing their job. They are continue to refuse to do their jobs. Our schools have been closed during the pandemic when private schools in our city were open, and schools across the country and across the world were open. I've seen my son being not able to go to school in 3rd grade, but I could go to a restaurant, I could go to the gym, there were concert venues packed of people. So I want to raise and represent our district to make sure that this doesn't happen again, that we focus on crime, that we focus on schools, and we focus on the economy. New York City has to continue being a place of economic prosperity where people who want to study, to work, to build are welcome and have the opportunities that this city has afforded to so many, including my family. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And Brian.
Thank you for hosting tonight and for having this opportunity for all of our residents to find out what's going on in what as you noted, is a very peculiar election year. So we have this August 23rd primary. I'm running for re-election to the state Senate on a very strong record of delivering legislative solutions for some of our biggest problems. I've chaired the Housing Committee for the last few years. In 2019, we passed the strongest tenant protection legislation and that's passed anywhere in America in literally half a century, protecting millions of people from being displaced from their homes and from exorbitant rent increases. During the COVID pandemic, I sponsored and passed a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, and the most comprehensive moratorium passed by any legislature in America that lasted 22 months. I also sponsored and passed the legislation that put in place a $4 billion relief program to ensure that renters as well as the property owners had the relief necessary to cover the costs of their buildings, and making sure that no one is going to come out of this pandemic without kind of enormous debts. We're still working on fully funding that program. On gun violence prevention, it's been a big issue for me. We've seen our Supreme Court try to weaken our laws. I was one of the people that spearheaded the New York SAFE Act, and I wrote our red flag law, which allows guns to be removed from people who present themselves as likely to harm themselves or others. And most recently, within 8 days of the Supreme Court ruling a portion of our gun laws unconstitutional, I was back in Albany on July 1st and led the debate to pass the laws to put those our parenting laws back in place. And again, we now have some of the strongest gun laws in America and one of the lowest rates of gun-related death. Similar stories on climate change, on the most generous funding of our schools in the state's history. In so many areas, we've worked very hard over the last few years to really deliver for New York. And I look forward to continuing that work with the consent of the voters of the district. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Brian. So you just talked a lot about keeping the city safe. As we know, crime and violence has gone up during and post-pandemic. There have been a lot of calls to defund the police. There's been all kinds of discussion about bail reform. I'd like to know where each one of you stands on the notion of defunding the police department. Let's start with you, Vittoria.
Sorry, I had to unmute there. So thank you for the question. Obviously, this is on everyone's mind. We all have a sense of unsafety when we walk in the streets. I have a young daughter who wanted to go to school on the subway by herself. And we said, this is not something that we were ready to do, even though her brothers at her age were able to do so. So I really get this sense. But what we need to do is we need to actually help our police. We need to unburden them of taking care of certain issues that are not in their purview, such as homelessness and social services, such as, if you have people with drug addictions also need to get help. And there are actually some really good programs across the country. The most commonly known is Cahoots, which is in Eugene, Oregon, where they team up the mental health hospital with the police department. And it's called an alternative dispatch system. So essentially they will dispatch when a call comes in, emergency call comes in, they determine whether or not, and they need to be trained for this, whether or not this is something for the police to handle or something for a mental health professional or a social service worker. And this is shown to be very, very effective for both homelessness and driving down crime. And it also frees up the police to do the jobs that they were hired to do.
Okay, so what do you think about that? Oh, I'm sorry, Steve, go ahead.
No. I gave time.
Oh, okay. So
One-
I'm curious, Brian, being somebody who's done a lot of work in the state legislature on this very issue. What do you think about this idea of her suggestion with the teaming up with the mental health hospital, therapists or doctors or whatever they are to do that sort of thing to help the police?
Yeah, a lot of that work is going on already, and I don't think it's an either or. There are many people who've spoken about defunding the police, talk about ensuring that police are not responding to certain situations at all. And when there have been some high profile instances where police have responded and there have been tragic results, that is obviously we want to make sure that our police are not, improperly harming people. That we've worked very hard in New York to drive down the number of instances where there are improper shootings, and obviously any improper violence by police on New Yorkers is very problematic. And I know that, we're all concerned about keeping the police accountable. At the same time, we should not be talking about removing resources from the police department at this time. I think there was a candidate in this race who's now running for something else who talked very frequently about defunding the police as a core strategy. And I think that really is the wrong message. We need to work with the police departments and our individual precincts, as I do very frequently. We need to make sure that they are both being responsive to our communities and also addressing the serious public safety issues that we have.
Danielle, how do you feel about this notion of defunding police?
I'm absolutely against defund the police. And I think unburden the police is a new version of defund the police, right? The program that Vittoria was mentioning, it's a tiny program that has no indication that would work on a city of the scale of New York City and with the problems that we are facing today. We have something that have worked for a very long time here in New York City before bail reform. We had one of the safest cities, large cities in the world, and that's what we need to go back to. We need to change bail reform. We need to keep some parts that are working, but the majority of the law, which is a travesty, it has made our families unsafe. It has made our communities unsafe. It needs to change and it needs to be repealed. And that's what I'm gonna do when I go to Albany. I'm gonna represent actually supporting the police, making sure that we're not in the cycle of arresting somebody who is released a few hours later and is back on the street committing exactly the same crime and just usually go on an escalating pattern. So I am actually the candidate who is serious about crime, and he's going to change the laws that Mayor Adams has begged Albany to change, because we all know that crime is not going to be controlled in New York until the law is changed.
So talking about bail reform.
Wait, hold on a minute. I just want to add in one thing. I'm sorry, Jane.
Yep.
Danyela, right? You say it right.
Yes.
Mayor Adams did request an emergency session in Albany. So Senator Kavanagh and to all three of you, are you willing, do you agree with that? Would you go back to Albany tomorrow to address bail reform or no?
I would absolutely go back tomorrow.
And
Was the senator of our district.
I have great respect for the mayor, but I think that particularly this most recent statement, we had an instance where somebody attacked. There was an altercation between a police officer and a teenager. That teenager had been arrested recently, and they had been released without bail in spite of being fully eligible for bail. So it was not the bail reform law that caused that person to be out. It was the decision of the prosecutor and the judge to release a teenager. The bail reform law was necessary and important because for a very long time in this town, we were holding people, sometimes indefinitely, who committed a very minor nonviolent crime without, and we were holding them not because they had been convicted of anything, not because everybody who commits that crime or is accused of that crime is held, but because they didn't have money. That is a terrible approach to public safety. It was not improving public safety. As Danyela knows, and we have gone back to all the drawing board on this twice. We passed the law 2 years ago, and in each of the subsequent sessions, we've made changes to it. Specifically, something that my colleague just referenced, we added a provision that allows if somebody is arrested for a minor crime, and then they're rearrested for a similar minor crime, they can be held with bail in that circumstance. That was to address some concerns we heard from police and from some of our communities. This is an ongoing thing, but I would note that crime is up in virtually every major city in the country. The rest of the country did not do bail reform in this time period. We do need to work to keep people safe, but bail reform has become a proxy for all the things people want to change. It is not the thing that is driving violent crime in our city.
I do want to point out though, Brian, according to a new report I'm reading, it says the average bail amounts have risen, not fallen, since they took effect in January 1st of 2020, and people continue to be able to afford the price of their freedom. So what do you say to that?
I say that many thousands of people were being held in Rikers because they could not afford their freedom. One of the cases that most prominently became to people's attention was Khalif Browder, who ended up in Rikers for more than a year because he had been accused and not convicted of stealing a backpack. And, of course, that case came to light partly because tragically after leaving jail, he committed suicide. But that story was told again and again and again. We live in a society where people are innocent until proven guilty, and holding people for non-violent crimes. And people who are listening should understand, if you commit a violent crime like the one that this young man was accused of, that the mayor has been talking about in the papers the past couple of days, you can be held on bail just as you always have been in New York. That is not changed. There's nothing about the law that has changed about that. So
there is, excuse
May I
me,
respond?
there's raise the age, which is another thing. He was under the age of 18, and under raise the age law, another law that the Senate passed, there's a loophole where they can't be charged in adult criminal court.
Stephen, yes, we decided to not deem 16-year-olds to be 18 under the law. We were one of the last states in America to reform that. But having said that, again, the question is whether this young man should have been out, and whether the fact that he was not being detained for a first crime had in any way caused the second crime. And again, there was the DA in that case declined to seek bail. The judge declined to set bail. And as a result, that young man was out. There's nothing about raise the age that would have prevented them from detaining that young man if they chose to. They chose not to detain him. That is not a decision the legislature made. That is the kind of decision that's been made thousands of times by our judges and our prosecutors over the course of many years. And that's not what has changed. We do have a serious problem of increasing violence in our communities, and we do need to address that. But bail reform, whatever questions people have, it is not driving the violent crime. And there's very little evidence that raise the age, that our decision to treat teenagers like teenagers is driving the violent crime either.
I see both of you. Go ahead, Daniela.
Yeah.
And then Victoria.
So Mayor Adams did not ask for a special session because of this one case. He has been asking to change bail reform since he took office. It's very misleading to talk about this case when we all know, people know what bail reform has done to our city. I have been in the local pharmacy in my neighborhood, which is a considered safe neighborhood. There is a man who goes to the pharmacy and steals products there every week. and every week he's out again. I agree, it's not a violent offense. So are you defending that now people who are repeated offenders should not just be released? No,
Okay.
and you know what? Let me finish. I let you finish. Now you let me finish. The manager said every time we call the police, the first precinct knows him. They come, they arrest him. In a few hours, he's going to be out. Release and repeat, release and repeat. This is happening all over our city. There is already communities on the north side where their local farms have been closed because of constant stealing. This is what our city has become, and we all know how we feel in the subway, how we feel walking the street with our kids. So if people think bail reform have not created problems, you should definitely vote for Mr. Kavanagh. If you vote for me, I'm going to address bail reform. I'm going to be serious about controlling crime, because I grew up in Brazil. I know exactly how it feels every time you leave your house. You're afraid of being mugged. You're afraid of being kidnapped. You're afraid of having a gun on your head. I don't want my kids to grow like that.
If I just may respond, since you addressed me directly, and thank you. Sorry to interrupt for a minute. I just wanted to clarify something there. But I grew up in New York City, so I know what it's like for the city to be very violent and for people to be afraid. We had some very, very dangerous years in New York City when we were the mugging capital of the country. Nobody wants to go back to that. I commuted an hour and a half across the city in the 80s as a teenager every day to go to high school. It was a dangerous place. Nobody wants to go back to that. The simple fact is the circumstance that you described has been addressed subsequent to our initial law. We did go back to the drawing board. We did pass a law that allows the prosecution and the judge to set bail in exactly the circumstance you described. If the judge is choosing not to, or the prosecutor is choosing not to, that is the status quo before we change the law, and nothing is going to require us to, in no way can the legislature require every judge and every prosecutor to set bail in every case. And again, bail just keeps people in jail who don't have money. It doesn't keep people in jail who do dangerous things to people.
Mr. Kavanagh, we are already back to the 90s, with all due respect.
Vittoria.
Thank you. So I want to first clarify that I have never said and never participated in defund the police. Unburdening the police is an entirely different thing. The fact that the police have to deal with issues that they are not equipped to deal with slows them down with dealing with other things. I agree with a tremendous amount of what Senator has said. Ooh.
You're fine.
Okay. Sorry, it looked like something popped up saying I was signed out.
You're not. You're
too
good.
animated here. But essentially, I mean, we want to address crime. We have to address what is causing crime. And bail reform, there is nothing that has shown us that bail reform is doing that. In fact, not only as Senator Kavanagh indicated across the country where crime has risen, regardless of that, regardless of bail reform, we've also had our comptroller issued a report that showed that there was no increase in recidivism in terms of for those pre-bail reform and post-bail reform. So people awaiting trial, there was no higher rate. Actually, forgive me, it was a lower rate pre-bail reform, and then post-bail reform, it was 1% lower of people actually creating going back and being recidivists. And when it comes to violent crimes, that was 99% post-bail reform. So we want to address crime. We have to address the issues that actually will affect it. And that is homelessness, and that is housing, and that is healthcare. Making sure that our citizens are taken care of and that we can get back on our feet after COVID that has devastated all of us.
All right, thank you. You just mentioned housing. And of course, during each one of your opening statements, particularly you, Vittoria, and Brian, you discussed tenants and you discussed affordable housing and what you want to do for it. I know that, Brian, you've talked about the protections that you brought for tenants, but in your mind, Vittoria, is there enough protection for tenants now in New York City?
So thank you for that question. No, I mean, certainly good cause eviction should have been passed 2 years ago. Still needs to be passed, and that's really important to protect our tenants. But what we have problem what we have right now is that this is protecting tenants, but when the rates are going up, it doesn't matter. If they can't afford it, then they can't stay. And we have lost, and by Senator Kavanagh's own stats that he said in past forums, our district has lost more affordable housing than any other district in the state. And this is, and Senator, you are the chair of the housing committee.
Right,
So
and those, as you know, those losses predate the rent reform that we did in 2019.
But that's housing. We're going to lose between this year and 2027. We're going to lose another 2,100 affordable units here in downtown. And we have nothing coming in to help affordability. How are we going to make this happen? And honestly, it was, again, what you said was that it was last 10 years. Is that my time, or finish my sentence? Last 10 years, you have been in office for 5 years.
You want to respond?
Sure. Again, I think other folks who are listening tonight were not in the room. We're referring to a prior conversation and a prior debate. This particular Senate district, the one actually that I represent now, so which is somewhat like the one we're talking about running in, was the largest loser of affordable units to deregulation. And deregulation was on the books for many years until 2019, when I wrote and passed the law to repeal all the deregulation provisions of in something called the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. That protects about 2.5 million New Yorkers. Again, they have among the strongest tenant protections in the country. There is no more deregulation, and basically every unit that is regulated now will continue to be regulated. For many years, as we added affordable units, those additions were offset by losses through deregulation. That's why I repealed deregulation and also put many other protections in place. I also have been a co-sponsor of the Good Cause Eviction bill since 2019 and have worked to get it passed. The first hearing of this year in the Senate was a hearing on that issue. I continue to push for that. And looking forward, we have an enormous capital budget of $5.5 billion for new affordable housing and many billions of dollars in the expense budget. And I see my time is passed.
What did you say? $500 billion?
5.5 billion is the state capital budget that we passed this year, and an additional $2.5 billion in expenditures to cover housing needs in the state budget that we passed this past April.
I am curious though, and I know Senator, you're the sitting senator, so I have to ask you, but all of you is, you also let the legislature let the 421A subsidy sunset. And Governor Hochul actually put up, I forgot the number that she put, but it was an alternative plan which would allow developers to, with a more affordability AMI, right? American median income, and the legislature let that go. And now the developers are saying it's creating a city of very wealthy and very poor with no middle income affordable housing. Were you happy to see 421A sunset?
421A, as currently constructed, was far too generous to the developers. That convinced the Republicans who controlled the Senate last time it needed to be renewed to pass it in a way that was very generous to developers. We got very little affordability in exchange for very large amounts of taxes that the city was foregoing. The program expired on June 15th. There was no short-term consequence of that expiration, but the part of the reason we end up with 421A is we have a really warped property tax system. So I've joined Brad Lander and others in talking about figuring out how to fix the property tax system so it is not such a disincentive to developing affordable rental housing, multifamily housing. Having said that, if there is a need for tax subsidies, we can do a program. 421A was far too generous, again, to developers getting much too little benefit in terms of affordability. So I think it was good that that particular program expired. But we will continue to figure out how to work with the city to figure out how to incentivize affordable housing development.
Danielle, you want to weigh in on this?
Yes. Well, first I want to say that I'm against good cause eviction. I have talked to so many small property owners, usually from minorities, and who are, they are losing now their properties. They are being bought by big developers because they cannot afford. They have had so many problems with their tenants, and I really think that we cannot go and pass this law, which will be so problematic and will continue decimating small property owners. And I agree with what Stephen said, that we also, it's not just about the low income house, but also just affordable for middle class. I think we need to be creative and work in partnership with the private sector to have a modern Mitchell Lama program where we are creating supply of middle income housing and making sure that, you know, families can stay in the city. I have talked to so many voters who say, you know, my kids grew up here and now they cannot afford to raise their families here. They had to leave the city. This is a serious problem that it impacts communities because it breaks those, you know, those connections that families have. And I want to make sure that we address this in creative ways, in sustainable ways, and in partnership with the private sector.
Okay.
So I'd like to jump in as well. I think we also downtown have a tremendous number of empty luxury apartments. And this is artificially driving up the market rate downtown. So one of the proposals I would do is to tax these empty luxury apartment units. So what happens is these developers take out loans to build these buildings. We actually have 2 buildings downtown that went into foreclosure because they couldn't sell out what they needed to. So, but they take out these loans, and these loans are based on, the value of the loans are based on their asking price for the units. So if they drop the asking price, the values of these loans, which many of the developers have their own interest in that are on the equity market, is going to drop as well. So they lose. So we tax those. Either they're incentivized to drop those, or we can raise funds to subsidize affordability downtown. I agree. This housing problem it hurts our lowest income the most, but it's hurting all of us. And we will lose our tax base because everyone is going to move out. Certainly my children can't afford to live down here.
What kind of empty luxury apartments are you talking about? Rental units or?
Rental units, yes.
Okay. And why are they empty? Because they're unaffordable?
Because these people aren't renting at the prices that they're asking.
So they're unaffordable for most people.
It's so unaffordable, exactly.
Okay. So you just talked about people moving out. I mean, there's been a lot of people who've moved out, not because they can't afford being in the city, but because they left in the middle of the pandemic. Are you concerned about the tax base and the dollars coming in? Isn't that a big problem, Senator Kavanagh?
I think that we need to make sure that our city continues to be a place where people can thrive, where businesses can thrive, where we continue to be the destination that we've been for several decades now. I think that obviously COVID and very dramatic departures from the way we used to do business, including, you know, what we're doing today. I think it's fair to say 2 years ago, well, 4 years ago, this debate probably would have been in person and there might have been a live audience. You know, business, obviously patterns have changed. Many people have decided that they can stay in homes that are not in commuting distance from the city and still do their work. But we've actually seen a giant return, and we have very low vacancy rates, and that has driven up rent. So I think businesses returning to their offices has been much slower than people returning to their residences in New York, judging from the vacancy rates. But no, we do need to be concerned about the health of the city. But I think that's mostly about you know, keeping the public health situation under control, making sure our transit system's working, making sure that we keep crime at the very low rate that we've been blessed with for many years until the last couple of years. So again, I will work on all of those things.
Transit system. There've been a couple of references made to people being afraid to ride the subways. What do you do about that?
Let's start with Vittoria.
Well, again, I think this goes to the issue of making sure our social services are strong and helpful and are able to get to the people who need it. I remember taking my daughter to school on the subway, probably March or April, and being accosted more than once by someone who clearly had mental health issues. And if we're able to reach people, then we'll be able to help them come off. And again, this is something that the police can do, but you know, if you speak to mental health professionals, you know that sometimes when you have a uniformed person show up, someone in a police officer, that can escalate a situation. And that's why we want to be bringing in mental health professionals, people who know how to speak to someone who is having a mental health crisis. And then I know also putting in the the partitions on the subway, I think would be a really good idea. A lot of countries have done that, and that would be, you know, an added safety for a lot of people.
Putting in partitions, how much would that cost, I wonder? Danielle?
I think we need to increase police presence, and we need to make sure that people who are repeated offenders are not going back to the streets and causing more problems in our subway. You know, we're talking about, usually these policies are defended in a way that is, oh, we must be compassionate. There's nothing compassionate about what is happening in our subway. Now, the latest statistics that every 3 days, somebody is hit by the subway because there's somebody who is in such a mental health crisis or with addiction that is walking around the subway and is hit by the train. And this causes disruption. It has caused trauma for children who have seen these accidents happening. Nobody's going to go back to the office when this is your commute in New York City. Nobody's going to go back and wanted to come live here when this is the daily life of New Yorkers. And the reality is that our current elected officials have done nothing. Literally, there is no sense of urgency to really address these problems. Being here and talking about, we've been blessed with the levels of low crime in the past few years. I mean, last week in my neighborhood, a woman was with her 3 kids and somebody in a mental health with a crisis with a hammer was running after her and her children. If you think this is being blessed with low levels of crimes, you're definitely not in touch about what is happening in our district.
Brian?
Okay, I feel the need to clarify what I said was we were blessed with low levels of crime until a couple of years ago when we saw the recent increase. And of course, during this conversation, many other circumstances, I've expressed great concern about the rise in crime and continue to do so. And being in touch with residents of this community every day and living in this community, I certainly hear it and I see it. There was someone shot at 9:30 a.m. 2 blocks north of where I live on Avenue C. And so I am certainly aware of this. And also, again, as someone who's lived in the city my entire life, I've seen the crime go up dramatically over the course of many years and come down almost every year from 1991 until just a few years ago. But we are indeed in a time when we're moving in the wrong direction, and we need to address that. With respect to the subways, we do need to make sure people are not living in tunnels, living in stations, living on the trains. That does involve, making sure there are, as has been mentioned, experts in outreach, mental health services, and also, sometimes involves police officers. And I do think that we also need to focus on having more permanent housing available. I've got a program I've proposed called Housing Access Vouchers, which is now become the sort of official position of the homeless service providers, as well as virtually every affordable housing group and the property owners in New York. We would provide vouchers to cover the affordable housing, the permanent housing costs of people who would otherwise be homeless.
Thank you. Unless Jane, you want to go on, one thing I do notice, I just want to bring up, a big part of the district is Chinatown. There's a lot of anti-Asian hate, and there's a lot of issues among the Asian community. I believe is the fastest growing community in the entire city of New York. So I'm wondering what you 3 can do as senators to do more outreach to the Asian community and to address anti-Asian hate crimes.
I can get started. I have a long history of working with the Asian community, defending the educational programs that are very valuable to Chinatown residents, the gifted and talent programs. Even when we had elected officials demonizing the Asian community, going visiting our specialized high schools and saying, this looks like Chinatown because there are too many Asians, which for me, it just reminds when people thought there were too many Jews in our universities. It's very similar type of comment. And so I have been in touch with that community, and I can tell you the impact in Chinatown is so huge in terms of crime, because not only people are afraid, there are people who decided to stop working so they don't have to take the subway. There are old elderly women who told me that they don't go out anymore by themselves. They only go in groups. They try to not even use colorful clothes to not call attention to themselves. It's heartbreaking to hear the stories. The schools now cannot take the kids to the park because it's an open air drug market and they are afraid. So children cannot go out anymore for walks in the park. And it has a huge impact in the business community. The restaurants are deciding to close earlier because they are afraid of crime. And, this, of course, leave the streets even more open, and then people feel even more unsafe. So I will continue work with the Chinatown community as I have been since I was elected to the CC.
And I just want to interject, besides the crime that maybe the three of you would want to address, is a lot of the Asian community also, there is they believe that some of the testing to get into specialized high school is unfair toward them. And I mean, there's pushback among the Black and Latino community on that, I've heard the argument among the Asian community that it should just be, you either pass the test or you don't, if it's math or science. And I don't know if that's a state issue, but I'm interested in what your views are on it.
It is a state issue because the SHSAT, the only reason that the Blasio administration could not destroy the specialized high schools, it's because in state law, and they could not change the state law. All the other schools that had merit admissions have been destroyed by the previous administration. We don't have gifted and talented program anymore. So kids don't have access, unless you actually have resources to go to a private school, then you have access to advanced curriculum. There is no reason why we should have only a few of these schools in New York City. We should have a lot more. We should be talking about expanding. And as a Latina, it is insulting to say that we cannot, excel in this test. Given the same opportunities, giving schools that really can offer this advanced curriculum, our children are totally capable. I think it's a very insulting to the Latina community to say that our kids cannot excel at this test.
And I'd like the other, because I know, Vittoria, you're an educator and you're a senator, so.
I'm not. I have 4 kids.
That counts as being an educator.
No, that's cool.
I am not, but I have tremendous amount of respect for educators. It is a really tough job, and I really appreciate that. The real problem that we have is this test that we have actually does exclude certain demographics, whether we like it or not. Whether it does, it simply does. So we have, I think it's 10% Hispanic and 9% Black are in the specialized high schools. And that's not at all representative of the population in our city. So clearly there's something amiss with just using the standardized test. So I think it's really important. And I also, what drives me crazy about this whole conversation is that we're talking about only 4% of our high school students. And we're again, it's this red herring of let's talk about something rather than addressing the issue that we need to make sure our schools are preparing all of our children, all of them, especially the 96% who aren't lucky enough to get into a specialized high school, and that they're prepared to go on to do whatever work it is that they're going to be able to do to contribute to society.
Brian?
I'd like to address this, and I do think it is worth going back to the question of safety in Chinatown and anti-Asian hate, because I think that is an important issue in the district. We'll do this first. The fact that our specialized high schools, including Stuyvesant High School, which is located in this district, are so undiverse is much less than ideal. I think diverse education it's more just and fair and equitable because everybody has an opportunity, but also because diversity in schools is a value in an educational system. Having said that, the prior mayor announced without prior notice to virtually anybody, including the principals of these schools, that he was calling for a new admission system that had not been very well thought through and had not been benefited from the input of any stakeholders. And I, declined to support that. As was noted, there are 3 specialized high schools that by law must be done by a single standardized test. Interestingly, there were 5 other schools that are specialized high schools that use that test that the mayor also called to have the test not be the process anymore. And there's no law that says they have to continue to use that, but nonetheless, they have continued to use this selective high school admissions test for all of those schools. I do think it would be worth thinking about measures, an admissions process that is not solely based on that test, But the mayor's idea of basically tossing the test out and using, kind of a quota for each middle school, would not have improved the equity, would not have protected the quality of these schools. And I didn't support it then, and I don't support it now.
All right, I think it's time for us to give each other a chance to ask a question. Do you agree, Steve?
Yes, I do. And then
Okay.
Can we, so I don't mean to be a pest about this, but can we have, I think one of us and not all three of us had an opportunity to answer the question about Chinatown and safety and anti-Asian hate. I think it's an important topic for some of our listeners, if that's okay.
Okay.
Just take a minute, if I may take a minute.
With you, Jane?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so forgive me if that's pushy, but it is important.
I mean, you are right. It's an extremely important question.
All right, so Chinatown has gone through a very tough period over the last 2.5 years because COVID hit Chinatown far harder and far earlier. The Lunar New Year celebrations in 2020 were severely hit by people's anticipating of the coronavirus coming to the United States and by some very unfortunate rhetoric about it being a Chinese virus and lots of fear that was generated early on. And of course, that is part of the reason we've seen a lot increase in anti-Asian hate. We have taken steps to address that, working particularly with my Asian American colleagues in the legislature. We have put very large amounts of money on the table for organizations that specialize in working with the Asian community to address this concern in a manner that Asian American organizations feel will be most effective in their communities. We also need to address the fact that part of the reason Chinatown has become unsafe is because of the low traffic, the low pedestrian traffic, the businesses that are closing earlier. One of the ways to address that is to revitalize the economy. We did a $20 million downtown revitalization initiative grant that is now going through the final stages of the community determining how that can be best spent to revitalize the community. But again, focusing on safety, focusing on supporting our local business, and focusing on bringing that community back will also have a direct effect on the risk that people feel.
If I can I'll make it quick. I will echo much of what the Senator has said. I think we also need to fund the New York State Office of Victim Services that does a lot of works with organizations with a lot of the victims of hate crimes. And, certainly Chinatown has been near and dear. I was in Chinatown and, I go there regularly for lunch and whatnot. And I was there in February of 2020 and it was empty. It was completely empty and it was, heartbreaking and so unfair. Of course, we had really negative rhetoric coming out of the White House at the time. But it is true, our businesses need to come back. I mean, these small businesses are so critical. This is what makes New York so special, is our small businesses. So we want to make sure that we can help them stay, help them come back, or help these new businesses that are slowly, we see 1 or 2 businesses opening up. And we want to make sure they have all the support they need, whether that's help with some sort of commercial rent control or making sure that they have access to funds, particularly for minority small businesses.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Steve.
Oh, they can each ask a question, but we're running out of time. So should we have each ask a question, or I guess we can do it quickly? What do you think, Jane?
Yeah, real quickly, each one of you can ask one other candidate a question and they have 1 minute to answer it. So.
Do you want to take the order? Or?
No, Brian, you start. Ask somebody.
Okay. I'll ask Danyela, if I may. In your remarks earlier, you said that, talking about bail reform, you said we should keep some parts of it, but reform other parts of it. Can you talk about which parts of the reform you think we ought to keep? If any.
Yes, I think the intention of bail reform, as you mentioned, avoiding cases like Mr. Brown, of course, I am for that. But what I think is that the results of bail reform are very, very different and tragic compared to the intention, what it was. So I think I'm willing to have a conversation about addressing this problem, but we also need to be realistic and see what are the results on the ground of this policy, the results of us being the only state in the nation that doesn't give judicial discretion to judges to keep somebody behind bars when they are deemed a threat to public safety. So I do think that the intention is good, and we need to talk about solutions to that, but definitely we need to also deal with the reality in our streets. And that's the most important part for me, is if you spend 5 minutes talking to voters in our districts, everybody wants to change the reform. I have met like 1% of voters who think they are a fan of the reform. People are feeling unsafe. People are moving out. They're afraid for their kids, for their business. And for me, that's my priority, to deliver to our district.
Thank you.
Okay, Daniela, ask somebody a question.
I want to ask Mr. Kavanagh, what is his plan for our schools besides pumping more money in the system? So as you mentioned, we have record funding for our public schools, and we still have horrible results. We have families leaving the system like in dramatic numbers as we have never seen. And so what is our plan for schools that besides pumping more money in the system?
Okay, I think it's worth noting that it is a big role of the state to fund the schools. We underfunded our schools for many, many years in a way that was really inequitable, and we have now, but the state funding is the largest it's been in history, and I think that is an important and significant achievement. Having said that, currently the city has decided to go school by school and reduce funding based on current headcount. The city council and the mayor did that in the most recent city budget. That has caused reductions in services in our schools. Things that sometimes people consider extras, but really are essential. Art classes, other kinds of classes, and after school programs and all those things are being cut. I think that's a terrible thing to do in the middle of the pandemic. I think we need to make sure that the schools have the resources to deal with this incredibly difficult, traumatic moment that students and families are experiencing. The reductions, which are unusual historically, are, I think, a substantially result of COVID. I think people need to come back to the city.
I want everybody to have
Oh yeah, let me. So yes, I will. Sorry, that was hard to do a full plan in 1 minute, but I will stop there with respect to that. But thank you for the question.
All right, Vittoria.
So Senator Kavanagh, I'm sorry, I'm going to do this to you again, but I did not get a yes or no answer when we last asked you about the home attendant workers. And the question was very specifically whether you would support withholding funds to any organization that doesn't pay back in full the wages of their workers when we've had judicial proceedings that have found them to be liable.
I think the question you asked is, did I support them making the payments? And I said yes. And I suppose if they continue to violate the law, which none of them have suggested that they're going to do, in fact, they participated in these arbitration proceedings and have, to my knowledge, at least the major wonderful organizations in our district that are providing these services, like Chinese American Planning Council, have agreed that they will make these payments, that the arbitration
yes, the arbitration has the arbitration decision has given each worker $300. Workers that have lost over $200,000 in wages. So my question is, if they don't pay those back, those workers, not going forward, would you withhold funds?
If you're asking, would I shut down home care workers because of your assessment of
it's not my assessment.
I think question A isn't supposed to be a kind of an argument. Let me just try to answer your question. There was an arbitration. The workers were represented by the most powerful union in the state. The arbitration process was to determine the arbitration process was to determine what was owed. My understanding is that the providers are prepared to make the payments that have been determined to be owed to these workers. And in addition, the bigger problem is that we have a system that funds 24-hour home care as if it only takes 13 hours to do. I have supported funding that through the state, changing the law to prevent that from happening. This is a state funding issue more than it is an issue of organizations that are being demonized by folks who are supporting you in this race.
Okay, we need to move on. We're going to do closing statements from each of you, 1 minute, because we're getting close to losing all of our time. So let's start with Vittoria.
Sure. So thank you, Jane and Steve. Thank you so much. And thanks to my opponents for being here. Yeah. I'm running to make sure that all of our communities have a voice in our state Senate. As I mentioned in the beginning, I am deeply rooted in the Senate district. It is my home. I was here for 9/11, and despite the enormous challenges that Manhattan faced, we chose to stay, to raise our 4 children here and build our business here, because this is our community. There is nowhere I'd rather live. I care deeply about my neighbors, and I've worked across this district to build coalitions to address issues that affect all of us. I'm running so that my neighbors, colleagues, family, and friends downtown can have a leader they know will listen to them, work very hard for them every single day, and so we can live and thrive together. If I have the honor of serving our district, I would promise to you that I will show up, I will listen, and I will get things done. Thanks.
Okay, Daniela.
Thank you so much for having me, for hosting this debate. I love New York. I'm so grateful to the city and for all the opportunities that I have had here. And I'm so happy to be raising my family here. And if I have the honor of serving as a senator, I will work to make sure that the city is safe, that our schools can offer a really high quality curriculum for all children, and that our economy is back on track, that we have an environment where it's friendly to business. Our city is not going to be back until our legislators have the urgency to control crime, to change the laws that need to be changed, and to change our schools besides just sending more funds. We have now the highest per pupil in the nation, and still we are losing 100,000 students over the last few years. So if you think things have been going well over the past years when Senator Kavanagh has been serving as your senator, keep the course. If you want to change, you can vote for me and I'll deliver for Lower Manhattan.
Okay, Senator.
Thank you very much. I also want to thank my colleagues for their love for New York City, for the interest in public service that is reflected by running for this office and their interest in serving. I won't take personal responsibility for all of the negative things that happened during a global pandemic, but I have worked very hard to ensure that our district is well represented. I have been very productive in terms of passing laws that really have made a difference, preventing hundreds of thousands of people from being pushed out of their homes. And again, creating some of the strongest gun laws in America that's resulted in some of the lowest rates of gun-related death, literally saving people's lives every day through those laws. I am endorsed by over 75 different individuals and entities, including many of our resident leaders, many of our community organizations, and many of our elected officials, and many of our labor unions, because I have delivered for people in ways that matter. It would be a great honor to continue to serve this community, and I'm asking all the voters who are listening tonight for your vote on August 23rd. And again, thank you to Schneps and to our hosts for hosting tonight.
You're very welcome. Thank you all for joining us. And that's it for us. District 27. You've heard from the candidates. Now, make sure you vote. We'll see you in about 5 minutes. Right back here doing another debate. We're going to go to District 26, your old stomping ground, Brian.
Thank you very much.
All right. We will see you soon. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.